She helped a stranger, trapped in the rain, unaware he was the Duke who owned her father's house. My lovely family, it is the Victorian Royal Stories team again. If you are already excited about this story, hit that subscribe button now, like and share this video, because you are about to have the best moments of your life while watching this. The storm had been building for 3 days, and Beatrice Croft knew with the certainty of someone who had lived her entire 22 years on these moors that tonight would be the breaking point. She stood at the small window of the cottage, watching the sky darken from pewter to charcoal, feeling the atmospheric pressure drop like a stone in water. Behind her, the fire crackled in the hearth, warm and deceptively safe, while her father dozed in his chair, his breathing still labored from the chest complaint that had plagued him since midsummer. Her younger brother, Thomas, was mending a harness at the table, his hands moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned early that nothing could be wasted, nothing discarded before its usefulness was truly spent. "You're not going out in this," Thomas said without looking up, reading her stillness the way siblings learn to read each other's silences. "The eastern wall," Beatrice replied simply, reaching for her heaviest cloak from its peg by the door. "Can wait until morning." Morning may be too late. She fastened the cloak's clasp with practiced fingers, then reached for her canvas satchel, checking its contents by touch. The short iron pry bar, the coil of hemp rope, the wooden wedges her father had carved years ago when his hands were still steady. If that section goes, the water will flow straight down the slope and pool against our foundation. You know what happened to the Miller cottage 2 winters past? Thomas did know. Everyone on the estate knew. The Millers had lost half their floor to rot before the steward had bothered to authorize repairs, and by then the damage had cost 3 times what prevention would have required. The Millers had been evicted for failure to maintain the property, as if they had caused the neglect rather than suffered from it. "I'll come with you," Thomas said, already setting down the harness. "No." Beatrice's voice was gentle but absolute. "Father needs someone here if his breathing worsens. I know that wall better than anyone. I've patched it a dozen times already. I'll be quick." My lovely family, it gladdens my heart to have you here again. But before we continue with Beatrice's story, I need to ask you something. If you believe that stories about women who refuse to be dismissed, who fix what's broken instead of waiting for permission, deserve to be told, then please hit that subscribe button. Now let's see what happens when she gets to the wall. She was out the door before he could protest further, pulling the hood of her cloak up against the first fat drops of rain that had begun to fall with ominous purpose. The wind hit her immediately, coming across the open moorland with nothing to slow its fury. It carried the scent of wet earth and distant lightning, of autumn dying and winter gathering its strength. Beatrice bent into it, her boots finding the familiar path by memory as much as sight. The light was fading fast, that peculiar greenish twilight that preceded the worst storms, and already the ground was softening beneath her feet, the recent weeks of rain having saturated the peat and limestone until the moor itself seemed to be dissolving. She had walked this path 1,000 times, to check the sheep in the upper pasture, to gather the wild herbs that grew near the boundary stones, to simply escape the cottage's close walls when her father's illness made the air inside feel too thick to breathe. She knew every rise and dip, every place where water pooled in heavy rain, every rabbit hole that could turn an ankle if you didn't watch your step. This land was written into her bones the way letters were written into books, and she read it now with growing concern. The eastern boundary wall was the oldest section of the estate's perimeter, built a century ago from the local limestone that looked solid as faith but could be treacherous when water found its weaknesses. It marked the edge of the Duke's formal property, the line between tenant cottages and the wild moor beyond. And it had been slowly failing for 2 full seasons while Mr. Finch, the estate steward, promised repairs that never materialized. Beatrice had done what she could with the materials at hand, wedging stones back into place, packing gaps with clay and gravel. But she was holding back the inevitable with inadequate tools, and she knew it. The rain intensified as she climbed the gentle slope. No longer individual drops, but a cold, furious curtain that turned the air itself into water. Her cloak was already soaked through, the heavy wool clinging to her shoulders, and she could feel water beginning to seep into her boots despite the careful oiling she'd given them just that morning. The path had become a stream, ankle-deep in places, carrying loose soil and small stones downhill in a rushing current that sought every weakness in the landscape. Lightning split the sky to the west, illuminating the moor in stark white clarity for a single heartbeat. And in that flash, Beatrice saw what she had feared. The boundary wall ahead, a dark line against the hillside, with a visible gap where the central section had been. Even from this distance, she could see the water pouring through the breach, channeling directly down the slope toward the cluster of tenant cottages below. Thunder followed, a physical force that she felt in her chest. And then the rain redoubled its assault, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment to show its true strength. Beatrice quickened her pace, her practical mind already cataloging what she would need. The larger wedges, the pry bar to lever the displaced stones back into position, the rope to lash the temporary bracing. It wouldn't be a permanent repair, but it would hold through the night. Redirect the water away from the cottages, buy them time until proper masons could be brought in. If proper masons were ever brought in. If Mr. Finch ever authorized the expense. If the Duke even knew or cared that his tenants were one storm away from disaster. She pushed the bitter thoughts aside and focused on the immediate problem. This was what she did, what she had always done. She identified what was broken and she fixed it. Or she found a way to hold it together until someone with more resources could fix it properly. Fear, anger, resentment. Those were luxuries for people who had the time and safety to indulge them. Beatrice had work to do. The boundary wall loomed ahead through the rain, and she was nearly upon it when she heard something that didn't belong to the storm. A human voice, sharp with frustration, cutting through the thunder with cultured precision. Someone else was at the wall. Someone who, by the sound of that voice, had no idea what he was doing. The gentleman was attempting to repair the breach with what appeared to be velvet curtain ties. Beatrice stopped short at the edge of the collapsed section, rain streaming down her face, and stared at the scene before her with a mixture of disbelief and rapidly mounting frustration. The wall had failed exactly where she had predicted it would, a 10-foot gap where the limestone had finally surrendered to weeks of water erosion. Through the opening, the moorland stream that normally meandered harmlessly past the boundary had found a new course, pouring through the breach in a muddy torrent that was carving a deeper channel with each passing minute. And there, knee-deep in rushing water and sinking mud, was a man who clearly had no business being anywhere near manual labor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His coat was made of deep blue velvet that must have cost more than her father earned in a year, now thoroughly ruined by mud and water. His boots were fine leather, completely unsuited for this terrain, and his hands, she could see even from here, were smooth and uncalloused as he struggled to wedge the decorative rope between 2 displaced stones. The rope, predictably, was already beginning to fray and dissolve in the water. "Sir!" Beatrice had to shout to be heard over the storm. "That will not hold." He spun toward her voice, nearly losing his balance in the mud, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. Handsome in the sharp-featured way of the gentry, with gray eyes that were currently narrowed in what looked like equal parts surprise and irritation at being interrupted. There was something in his bearing, even mud-covered and clearly failing at his task, that spoke of natural authority, the kind of unconscious certainty that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. "I beg your pardon?" His accent was refined, every syllable precise despite the wind trying to steal his words. Beatrice waded into the gap without waiting for invitation, her practical boots finding purchase where his fashionable ones had failed. She could feel the water's force against her legs, trying to push her downslope, and she braced herself against the remaining section of wall. "Your rope, sir. It is decorative silk. It will not hold against this current for more than an hour, and when it fails, the breach will be twice this size by morning. I am quite capable of managing my own property, miss." His voice had gone cold, the kind of aristocratic frost designed to put commoners in their place. Under any other circumstances, Beatrice might have stepped back, apologized, retreated to safety, and let him fail on his own. But the water pouring through this gap was heading directly toward her cottage, toward her father struggling to breathe in his chair, toward everything her family had. She had no time for wounded pride, his or her own. "Then you are managing it poorly, sir." She dropped her satchel on the one dry stone remaining above the waterline and pulled out her tools. "Stand aside, if you please, or help, if you are capable. But stop making it worse." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and she thought he might order her away, might assert whatever authority his fine clothes and refined accent represented. But then lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the torrent pouring through the gap. And perhaps he saw what she saw, that this was beyond his ability to fix with inappropriate materials and pure stubbornness. He stepped aside. Beatrice moved into the breach with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work her entire life. The problem was clear. 3 of the wall's foundation stones had been undermined by water erosion and had shifted out of position, creating a gap that the stream had immediately exploited. The solution was equally clear, though far from easy. She needed to redirect the water's flow temporarily, shore up the foundation, and wedge the displaced stones back into place. "Hand me that fallen stone," she said, pointing to a piece of limestone half buried in mud upstream. "The flat one." To his credit, the gentleman did not argue. He retrieved the stone, struggling with its weight, and brought it to her. Beatrice positioned it at an angle across the current, creating a temporary dam that diverted part of the flow away from where she needed to work. Already the water level in the breach began to drop slightly. "Now, the pry bar from my satchel. The iron tool." He found it, handed it to her, and watched as she wedged it beneath the largest displaced stone. She had to brace her entire body weight against the bar, her boots sliding in the mud. But gradually the stone shifted. 1 inch, 2 inches, enough. "The wedges," she gasped, holding the stone in place with the bar. "The wooden pieces. Wedge them into the gap beneath." His hands were clumsy with cold and inexperience, but he managed, shoving the carved wedges into the space she had created. When she released the pry bar, the stone held. They worked in silence after that, falling into an unspoken rhythm. Beatrice directed, he assisted, and stone by stone the breach began to close. She packed clay and gravel into the gaps. He handed her materials from her satchel. She angled timber bracing to support the weakest sections. He held them in place while she lashed them with her hemp rope. The rain continued its assault, and the thunder rolled across the moor like artillery fire, but the wall was holding. 30 minutes, perhaps 40. Time lost meaning in the storm. But finally Beatrice stepped back, water streaming from her cloak, and assessed her work. The repair was rough, temporary, but it would hold through the night. The water was flowing past the wall now, instead of through it, seeking easier paths down the hillside away from the cottages. The gentleman was staring at her again, with that same expression she had seen earlier, confusion mixed with something else she could not quite name. "That was," he began, then seemed unable to find the words. "Adequate," Beatrice supplied, gathering her tools back into her satchel. Everything was caked in mud, including herself. "It will need proper repair come spring. Mason work, not temporary bracing. The foundation is compromised." He reached into his coat, and she saw his hand emerge with several coins, gold sovereigns that caught the lightning's flash. "For your assistance. You have—" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, and she softened it with effort. "I did not do this for payment, sir. I did it because if this wall failed, the water would have reached my family's cottage by morning." She shouldered her satchel and met his eyes directly. "Keep your money. Keep the land safe, sir. That is payment enough." She turned to leave, exhaustion pulling at her limbs now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Wait," he called after her. "Your name?" "I should know," but Beatrice was already walking away into the rain, following the path back down toward the cottage where lamplight glowed warm in the window. She did not look back. Whatever gratitude he felt, whatever debt he imagined he owed, it did not matter. She had done what needed doing. The rest was his responsibility. Behind her, Lord Phillip Ellington, Duke of Winthrop, stood alone in the mud and rain, watching her disappear into the storm, and realized he had just been saved by a woman whose name he did not know, and that the thought of never seeing her again filled him with something very close to panic. Beatrice discovered the stranger's identity 3 days later in the worst possible way, through the malicious satisfaction in Mr. Finch's voice. She had come to the estate office in the village to pay her family's quarterly rent, a ritual she had taken over from her father when his illness had made the walk too difficult. The office was a cramped room above the posting house, smelling of damp paper and tobacco smoke. Its walls lined with ledgers that recorded every transaction, every debt, every failing of the Duke's tenants in meticulous, unforgiving detail. Mr. Finch sat behind his desk like a toad on a stone, pale and soft, and watching everything with cold, calculating eyes. He was perhaps 50. With thinning hair he combed carefully across his scalp, and a mouth that seemed to rest naturally in an expression of contempt. He had been the estate steward for nearly a decade, and in that time he had perfected the particular cruelty available to men who wielded just enough power to make lives miserable without ever risking their own comfort. "Miss Croft," he said, not rising as she entered. "How industrious of you to come. Your father continues poorly, I trust?" Beatrice set the small leather purse containing their rent on the desk, ignoring the veiled insult. "Our payment, Mr. Finch, in full, as always." He made no move to take it, instead leaning back in his chair with a thin smile. "Ah, yes. Though I wonder if in full will remain accurate much longer, given the state of your cottage's foundation. The dampness must be worsening. Such a shame when tenants fail to properly maintain their properties." "The dampness worsens because the boundary wall has needed repair for 2 seasons, Beatrice replied evenly, "as I have mentioned in 3 separate written requests, which you have yet to authorize. Estate funds are not infinite, Miss Croft. His Grace has many properties requiring attention. Your cottage is hardly a priority." Finch's smile widened slightly. "Though speaking of His Grace, I understand you encountered him during the recent storm. How forward of you." The words hit her like cold water. "His Grace?" the Duke of Winthrop himself, out surveying the storm damage to his property. Finch drew out each word with obvious relish, watching her reaction. Did you truly not recognize him? How extraordinary. Though I suppose one cannot expect tenant farmers to be familiar with their betters, especially when those tenants take it upon themselves to offer unsolicited assistance to gentlemen who neither need nor desire it. Beatrice's mind reeled. The stranger at the wall, the man with the useless silk rope and the fine velvet coat now ruined by mud, that had been the Duke. The owner of the entire estate. The man whose signature appeared at the bottom of every rent notice, every denial of repairs, every official document that governed her family's existence. The man whose hand had brushed hers as she returned his signet ring. She forced her voice to remain steady. I was not aware of His Grace's identity. I saw only a section of wall in danger of collapse and acted to preserve the property, as any responsible tenant would do. Responsible, Finch repeated, tasting the word like something sour. Yes, His Grace mentioned your enthusiasm. He seemed quite taken with your forthright manner, though I felt it my duty to clarify certain matters for him. Beatrice's stomach tightened. What matters? The true state of the Croft tenancy, naturally. Your father's declining health, the cottage's deteriorating condition, the very real possibility that come spring, the property may need to be reassigned to a tenant more capable of maintaining it. He finally reached for the rent purse, weighing it in his palm. His Grace values competence, you see, and a tenant who cannot keep their own home in good repair, regardless of how well they can stack stones in a storm, is not truly competent, merely interfering. The threat was clear as glass. Finch had seen the Duke's interest, however innocent or momentary it might have been, and moved immediately to poison it, to reframe her assistance as presumption, her capability as interference. And in doing so, he had reminded the Duke that the Crofts were vulnerable, their tenancy precarious, their continued residence entirely dependent on the steward's recommendations. Our rent is paid in full and on time, Beatrice said quietly. Our lease is legal and binding, and the cottage's condition is directly attributable to deferred maintenance that you, as steward, have refused to authorize. Your opinion on estate management has been noted, Miss Croft. Finch opened his ledger and made a notation with deliberate slowness. As has your tendency toward insubordination. You may go. Beatrice left the office with her hands shaking, though whether from anger or fear, she could not say. The rain had returned, lighter now but persistent, and she stood in the muddy street letting it cool her flushed cheeks while her thoughts churned. The Duke. She had corrected the Duke, had told him he was managing poorly, had refused his money. And now Finch knew, and whatever small power that knowledge gave her, the possibility that the Duke might remember her assistance, might be favorably disposed toward her family. Finch had already moved to neutralize it. She should never have gone to that wall. Should have stayed home and let the flooding come and dealt with the consequences as they always had, quietly, without drawing attention, without giving men like Finch ammunition to use against them. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. She would do it again. She would always do what needed doing, regardless of the cost. She pulled her cloak tighter and began the walk home through the rain. At Winthrop Manor, in a book-lined study that overlooked the formal gardens, Phillip Ellington stared at the ledger his solicitor had just placed before him and felt something very close to rage building in his chest. He had not been able to stop thinking about the woman from the storm. Her competence, her pride, the way she had moved through the crisis with absolute certainty while he had floundered like a schoolboy, the way she had refused his money, not from servility, but from dignity, from a moral framework that made his offered coins seem like an insult rather than gratitude. He had returned to the manor that night, soaked to the bone, and immediately summoned his steward to identify her. Finch had provided the information with suspicious eagerness. Beatrice Croft, daughter of Thomas Croft, tenant of one of the estate's smaller cottages near the eastern boundary. Finch had then launched into an unprompted recitation of the Croft family's supposed inadequacies, their property's deteriorating condition, the father's illness making them unreliable tenants. It had felt wrong even then, that immediate rush to diminish her. And Philip had learned long ago to trust his instincts about men like Finch, competent enough to be useful, venal enough to require watching. So he had asked his solicitor, Mr. James Hartford, to conduct a quiet review of the estate's tenant records, beginning with the Croft family. What Hartford had found was damning. 3 formal requests for boundary wall repair over 18 months, Hartford said, pointing to the copied correspondence. All denied by the steward, citing insufficient funds. Yet here, he flipped to another page, are authorizations for decorative ironwork at the steward's residence, new furnishings for the estate office, and a rather substantial budget for administrative entertainment. None of which required your Grace's approval because they fell below the discretionary threshold. Philip studied the numbers with growing fury. The wall repair would have cost less than half of what Finch spent on his own comfort. Considerably less. And that is merely the Croft tenancy. I took the liberty of examining several others in that section of the estate. The pattern is consistent. Requests for essential maintenance denied while discretionary spending under the steward's control has increased steadily over the past 5 years. Show me the Croft family's rent payment history. Hartford produced another ledger. Paid in full, on time, for the past 7 years, without exception. Before that, the father's record going back 23 years is equally spotless. By any measure, they are model tenants. Philip sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. She had repaired his wall in a storm while her own home deteriorated from neglect he should have prevented. She had saved his property while Finch, his steward, his representative, had systematically failed in the most basic duty of estate management. And then Finch had tried to paint her family as inadequate. I want a complete audit of every tenant account, Philip said quietly. Every repair request, every denial, every expenditure under Finch's discretionary authority. And I want it done without Finch's knowledge. That will take time, Your Grace. Several weeks at minimum. Then begin immediately. Philip looked out the window toward the eastern moors, barely visible through the rain. And Hartford? Find out everything you can about the Croft family's current situation. Discreetly. I want to know exactly what has been done to them and what can be remedied. Hartford nodded and gathered his papers. At the door, he paused. May I ask, Your Grace, what prompted this particular concern? Philip remembered her eyes in the storm, steady and unafraid, remembered her hands, capable and sure, remembered her voice saying, "Keep the land safe, sir." "Call it," he said slowly, "a debt of honor." The carpenter arrived on a Tuesday morning, driving a well-maintained cart loaded with quality timber and proper tools, and Beatrice knew immediately that something was wrong. She was in the garden behind the cottage, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables before the hard frosts came, when she heard the cart's wheels on the path. Visitors were rare enough in their isolated corner of the estate, but visitors with expensive equipment and the confident bearing of skilled craftsmen were unheard of. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and watched as a man of perhaps 40 climbed down from the driver's seat. He was well dressed for a tradesman, his coat clean and his boots sturdy, and he carried himself with the self-assurance of someone whose skills were valued and well compensated. He touched his cap when he saw her, polite but not deferential. "Miss Croft, I'm John Murray, master carpenter. I've been engaged to assess and repair the structural issues with your cottage roof." Beatrice felt her stomach drop. Engaged by whom? "The estate, miss. I have a work order for immediate repairs. The supporting beam over the main room has begun to bow, and there's rot in the northwest corner where water's been coming through. Should take me 3, perhaps 4 days to set it right." She had mentioned the roof exactly once, in passing, to Mr. Finch during her last visit to the estate office. He had dismissed it with barely a glance, telling her that minor cosmetic issues were the tenant's responsibility to address. And now, less than a week after her encounter with the Duke, a master carpenter, not a day laborer but a genuine craftsman, had appeared with materials and authorization to make repairs that would cost more than her father earned in half a year. "I was not informed of any approved repairs," Beatrice said carefully. "There must be some mistake." Murray pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. It was an official work order, bearing the Winthrop Estate seal, authorizing immediate structural repairs to the Croft cottage roof and associated water damage, cost not to exceed £50 by order of estate management. £50. For repairs Mr. Finch had refused to authorize for 18 months. "Who specifically gave you this order?" Beatrice asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Murray's expression shifted slightly, the practiced neutrality of a man who knew when he was standing in the middle of someone else's conflict. "It came through the manor's main office, miss. The head steward's seal is there on the bottom. But if there's a problem, I can—" "No." Thomas had emerged from the cottage, alerted by the voices. Her brother's eyes went from the loaded cart to the work order in Beatrice's hand, and she saw him understand immediately that this was not routine estate business. "No, Mr. Murray, there's no problem. We're grateful for the repairs. Our father is inside, he's unwell, and may not be able to answer questions, but I can show you the areas of concern." Murray nodded and began unloading his tools, clearly relieved to avoid whatever family dispute was brewing. Thomas took Beatrice's elbow and guided her firmly away from the cottage, out toward the boundary wall she had repaired during the storm. "This is from him," she said quietly, urgently. "From the Duke. It has to be. Finch would never authorize this on his own, and the timing—" "Then we are fortunate," Thomas interrupted. "Beatrice, the roof is failing. You know it is. In another month, the rot will spread to the main beam, and then we'll be looking at structural collapse, not simple repairs. If the Duke wants to fix his own property, let him. Nothing is ever that simple. Not with men like that." She gestured toward the manor, invisible beyond the hills, but always present, always looming over their lives. "He remembers me from the storm. He's taking an interest. And when men of his class take an interest in women of ours, it never ends well." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching Murray set up his workbench in the yard. "You think he has dishonorable intentions?" "I think he has intentions, and I don't know what they are, and that uncertainty is dangerous." Beatrice folded the work order with deliberate care, her hand steadier than her thoughts. "We cannot afford his attention. Good or ill, it puts us at risk. Finch already knows about the storm. He made that clear when I paid the rent. If the Duke continues to single us out, if he makes our cottage some kind of pet project, Finch will find a way to use it against us. Or," Thomas said slowly, "the Duke is simply doing what any responsible landlord should do, maintaining his properties. Perhaps his encounter with you during the storm made him realize how badly the estate has been managed." Perhaps this has nothing to do with you personally and everything to do with him finally paying attention to what Finch has been doing. It was a reasonable interpretation, a hopeful one, and Beatrice wanted desperately to believe it. But she had lived too long as a tenant, had seen too many ways that power could be wielded casually or cruelly, to trust in the benevolence of aristocrats. The Duke might mean well. He might genuinely want to improve the estate. But his good intentions could destroy them just as thoroughly as Finch's malice if they drew the wrong kind of attention. Inside the cottage, she found her father awake in his chair, watching Murray work with a mixture of confusion and cautious relief. Thomas had already explained the situation in whatever terms would cause the least distress, and their father seemed willing to accept the repairs as a simple correction of previous neglect. Beatrice knelt beside his chair. "Papa, did anyone from the manor contact you? Send any messages about repairs?" "No, dear. Nothing." His breathing was labored, as it always was now, but his eyes were clear. "Thomas says this is just estate maintenance. Long overdue, but nothing unusual." "It's unusual," Beatrice said quietly. "The timing is unusual. I need to know, have you had any other contact with the Duke or anyone from the manor? Any requests? Any questions about our tenancy?" Her father's brow furrowed. "The Duke? Why would the Duke concern himself with us? We're just one small cottage among dozens." He reached out and took her hand, his grip weaker than it had been even a month ago. "Beatrice, you're seeing shadows. Let the man fix the roof. Winter is coming and we need it sound." She wanted to argue, to make him understand that nothing about this was routine or safe. But he was tired and ill, and the repairs were necessary. And perhaps Thomas was right. Perhaps she was seeing threats where there were only belated responsibilities being fulfilled. Murray worked through the day and into the next, replacing rotted timber with solid oak, resealing the corner where water had been seeping through, reinforcing the sagging beam with expert precision. He was professional and efficient, answering Beatrice's questions about the work with the patience of a master craftsman who took pride in his skill. On the third day, as he was finishing the external ceiling, Beatrice brought him tea and asked the question she had been holding back. "Mr. Murray, in your professional opinion, how long had that rot been developing?" He set down his tools and accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. "The corner damage? 2 years, perhaps more. The beam stress is more recent, 6 months, maybe 8. But both were entirely preventable with routine maintenance inspections." He met her eyes directly. "If you don't mind me saying, miss, someone should have caught this 18 months ago. Whoever's been managing estate inspections has been negligent." "Or deliberately blind," Beatrice murmured. Murray said nothing, but his expression suggested he had worked on enough estates to understand exactly what kind of negligence she meant. When he finished on the 4th day, the cottage roof was sound for the first time in 2 years. Murray packed his tools, accepted payment that Beatrice never saw exchanged, and departed with a respectful farewell. The work was flawless. The cottage was safer than it had been since before her father's illness began, and Beatrice felt more trapped than ever. That evening, she stood outside and stared toward the distant manor, barely visible as a dark shape against the twilight sky. The Duke had done this. Whatever his reasons, guilt, responsibility, or something more personal, he had reached into their lives and changed them with casual ease that demonstrated exactly how powerless they truly were. She should be grateful. She knew that. But gratitude felt too much like obligation. An obligation to a man with that much power was a chain, however well-intentioned. "Thank you," she whispered to the distant manor, the words bitter on her tongue. and God help us for needing it. The Duke of Winthrop had not attended Sunday service at the village church in 3 years. Beatrice learned this fact in the anxious whispers that rippled through the congregation when his carriage arrived precisely 5 minutes before the bells began to ring. She was already seated in the Croft family's usual pew, 3rd row from the back, left side, the same spot her family had occupied for 2 generations, when the whispers started like wind through dry leaves. His Grace is here. The Duke himself. When did he last come? Was it for old Lord Pemberton's funeral? No, that was the nephew. His Grace hasn't attended since. The speculation died abruptly as Phillip Ellington entered through the main doors. He was dressed with severe formality in black superfine wool and a perfectly tied cravat, his dark hair brushed back from his face. Every inch the aristocrat, he moved with unhurried confidence down the center aisle, nodding briefly to the vicar who had frozen mid-preparation at the altar, clearly as surprised as everyone else by this unprecedented attendance. Beatrice kept her eyes fixed firmly on the hymnal in her lap, willing herself to become invisible. The cottage roof had been finished 4 days ago. She had hoped, prayed even, that the Duke's interest in their family's situation had been satisfied by that single act of responsibility. That he would return to whatever occupied Dukes when they weren't making unexpected repairs to tenant properties and forget entirely about the woman who had corrected him in a storm. The hope died when she heard his footsteps stop directly beside their pew. "Mr. Croft." The Duke's voice was pitched for public conversation, clear and carrying in the suddenly silent church. "I trust you are recovering well. The damp weather cannot be easy with a chest complaint." Beatrice's father struggled to rise, his breathing labored, but the Duke gestured for him to remain seated. Thomas had gone rigid beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers in silent warning or support, she could not tell which. "Your Grace," her father's voice was thin but respectful. We are honored by your concern. The cottage repairs have made a considerable difference to my comfort. We are most grateful." "No gratitude is necessary. The maintenance was long overdue, a failure of estate management that I am working to correct." The Duke's gaze swept across their pew, acknowledging Thomas with a brief nod, and then settled on Beatrice with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Miss Croft, I trust your family has weathered the recent storms without further incident?" There was no avoiding a response. To ignore a direct address from the Duke in front of the entire congregation would be an insult that even her father's illness could not excuse. Beatrice raised her eyes to meet his, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "We have, Your Grace. Thank you for your inquiry." "I am pleased to hear it." Something flickered in his expression, amusement, recognition of her deliberate formality, before he inclined his head politely. "Please do not let me interrupt your devotions. Mr. Croft, I hope to see continued improvement in your health." He moved on to claim a seat in the front pew traditionally reserved for the manor, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. The whispers began again the moment he was out of earshot, no longer anxious, but avid with speculation. "Did you see?" He spoke directly to them. "The Crofts, of all families. What possible reason? I heard their cottage roof was repaired last week, a master carpenter no less. And he knew the father's illness, knew it specifically. When does a duke concern himself with a tenant's health? The daughter. Did you see how he looked at the daughter?" Beatrice felt her cheeks burning. Beside her, Thomas had begun a careful study of the church's ceiling beams, as if they were the most fascinating architecture in England. Their father seemed confused but pleased, interpreting the Duke's attention as simple landlord courtesy rather than what it so obviously was, a public singling out that would fuel gossip for weeks. Across the aisle and 2 rows back, She could feel Mr. Finch's stare like a cold blade against her neck. The service proceeded with painful slowness. Reverend Matthews stumbled over his opening prayer, clearly distracted by the ducal presence, and his sermon on humility and proper station seemed to take on an unintended irony, given the morning's events. Beatrice heard none of it. She was too aware of the eyes on her, the whispers being conducted behind prayer books and gloved hands, the story being constructed from the simple facts of the Duke's greeting. When the final hymn concluded, she tried to leave quickly, but the congregation had other plans. The aisle became a crush of people moving with deliberate slowness, each wanting to position themselves for a glimpse or a word with the Duke. And the Crofts found themselves trapped in their pew by the press of bodies. Mrs. Henwick from the posting house was the first to approach, her smile sharp with curiosity. "My dear Miss Croft, what an honor for your family. His Grace seemed particularly solicitous of your welfare." "His Grace was being courteous to all his tenants," Beatrice replied evenly, "as any responsible landlord would be." Of course. Though one cannot help but notice that he addressed your family by name, while the rest of us merited only a general nod." Mrs. Henwick's eyes glittered. "You must have made quite an impression somehow." Before Beatrice could formulate a response that would not worsen the situation, Mr. Finch materialized beside them with the unsettling timing of a snake emerging from tall grass. Indeed, Miss Croft has proven herself quite forward in her interactions with His Grace. Finch's voice was silk over steel. "I understand she encountered him during the recent storm and took it upon herself to offer unsolicited assistance. His Grace, being a gentleman of refined sensibility, naturally feels obligated to acknowledge the gesture, though I fear Miss Croft may have misunderstood the nature of such acknowledgement." The implication was clear as glass and twice as cutting. That Beatrice had deliberately positioned herself in the Duke's path. That she had manufactured the encounter. That her assistance had been a calculated attempt to attract aristocratic attention. And that the Duke's courtesy this morning was mere noblesse oblige toward a presumptuous tenant who had overstepped. Mrs. Henwick's expression shifted from curiosity to something more calculating. "How very enterprising." "It was nothing of the sort," Thomas interjected, his voice tight with anger. "My sister was checking our family's property during a storm and encountered a section of wall in danger of collapse. She acted to prevent damage to the estate, as any responsible tenant would. There was nothing forward or calculated about it." "Of course not," Finch agreed, his tone suggesting he believed the exact opposite. "Though one must be careful about appearances, particularly when one's family's tenancy is, shall we say, vulnerable due to circumstance." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward their father, whose labored breathing was audible even over the church's ambient noise. "It would be unfortunate if anyone were to mistake practical assistance for social ambition. His Grace values propriety above all else." The threat was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern, and therefore impossible to challenge directly without appearing defensive or guilty. Beatrice felt the trap closing around her. Anything she said would be used as evidence of exactly what Finch was implying. Silence would be interpreted as guilt. There was no winning move. "Mr. Finch," the Duke's voice cut through the conversation like a blade through fog. He had approached from the front of the church, moving against the flow of the departing congregation, and now stood close enough that his presence demanded immediate deference. "I was hoping to speak with you regarding certain discrepancies in the estate ledgers. Perhaps you could attend me at the manor tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Finch's face went through a remarkable transformation, from malicious satisfaction to careful neutrality to something that might have been fear, all in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Of course, Your Grace." I am always at your disposal. Excellent. The Duke's attention shifted to Beatrice, and his expression softened in a way that made her stomach twist with anxiety. Miss Croft, please convey my compliments to your father on his evident recovery. And should you encounter any further issues with the estate's infrastructure, I trust you will not hesitate to bring them to my attention directly, rather than waiting for official channels that have proven inadequate. He inclined his head politely, nodded to Thomas and Mrs. Henwick, and departed, leaving another shocked silence in his wake. Mrs. Henwick recovered first. "Well," she said, her voice bright with the anticipation of spreading fresh gossip. "How very interesting. Good day, Miss Croft. Mr. Croft?" She bustled away toward a cluster of other parishioners, already whispering. Finch remained a moment longer, his expression now carefully blank. But his eyes, when they met Beatrice's, were cold with pure malice. "Do be careful, Miss Croft," he said quietly. "His Grace's attention is a dangerous thing to court. Favor can turn to disappointment so very quickly, and when it does..." He smiled without warmth. "Well, I would hate to see your family suffer for your ambitions." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Beatrice standing in the emptying church with her brother's hand gripping her elbow, and the certainty that whatever the Duke had intended by his public greeting, the result was catastrophic. She had become visible. And for people like them, visibility was just another word for vulnerable. Okay, pause. Did you feel that? That moment when Finch weaponized social expectations against Beatrice? When she became visible and therefore vulnerable? If that made you angry, if you're sitting there thinking someone needs to take Finch down, then you need to like this video right now. Here's why. Every like tells YouTube that stories with real stakes matter. That you care about women trapped between malicious men and powerful men and their own pride. And if you don't like it, the algorithm assumes you want more vapid content instead of watching Beatrice navigate a ballroom full of people who think she's either a schemer or a mistress. So like this video. Subscribe and share it with someone who understands that the worst traps are the ones made of propriety and reputation. Because Beatrice is about to walk into the biggest trap of all, and she's going to need us to care enough to see her through it. Now let's watch the Duke discover exactly what Finch has been doing. The audit took Hartford 3 weeks to complete, and with each passing day, Philip's fury had grown colder and more precise. He sat now in his private study at Winthrop Manor, the afternoon light slanting through tall windows onto a desk covered with ledgers, correspondence, and carefully documented evidence of systematic theft. Hartford stood across from him, methodically laying out the final pieces of what had become not merely an investigation into estate mismanagement, but a catalog of deliberate corruption. "The pattern is consistent across 47 tenant properties," Hartford said, his solicitor's voice admirably calm, given the magnitude of what he was describing. "Finch has been falsifying maintenance requests as completed while pocketing the allocated funds. In cases where tenants complained or persisted in their requests, he either denied the need entirely or claimed insufficient estate resources." "While spending how much on his own comfort?" Philip asked, though he already knew the answer. He had memorized every damning figure over the past 3 weeks. Just over £800 in the last 2 years alone. New furnishings for the estate office, extensive renovations to the steward's residence, which, I should note, is estate property that required no such improvements. Regular, administrative dinners at the Crown and Heart that cost more per event than most tenants earn in a month. Hartford flipped to another page. All of it documented as legitimate estate expenses, all of it falling just below the threshold that would have required your direct authorization. Philip rose and moved to the window, looking out over the manicured grounds of the manor toward the distant moors where tenant cottages dotted the landscape like scattered stones. From here, they were barely visible, small, insignificant, easy to ignore, which was precisely what he had done. "The Croft family specifically," he said quietly. "What did you find?" Hartford's pause was answer enough, but he provided the details with professional thoroughness. 3 formal requests for boundary wall repair over 18 months, each documented with descriptions of worsening erosion and water damage. All denied. 2 requests for cottage roof maintenance, also denied. 1 formal complaint about rising damp in the foundation, dismissed as tenant responsibility for interior maintenance. He set down a separate stack of papers. Meanwhile, the Crofts have paid their rent in full and on time for 7 consecutive years. Thomas Croft, the father, has a spotless payment record dating back 23 years. By any objective measure, they are exemplary tenants who have been systematically neglected while their cottage deteriorated around them. Philip's voice was flat, controlled, but the anger beneath it was molten. "And when I authorized emergency roof repairs 3 weeks ago, what was Finch's response?" "He attempted to delay the work order, citing budget concerns. When I indicated the authorization came directly from you and was not subject to his approval, he requested a meeting to clarify estate priorities. I denied the request." "Good." Philip turned from the window. "What else?" Hartford hesitated, which was unlike him. "Your Grace, there is one additional matter regarding the Croft family that you should be aware of. Following your attendance at church service 2 weeks ago, Finch has been circulating certain implications about Miss Croft's character." The cold fury in Philip's chest crystallized into something sharper. "What implications?" "That she deliberately positioned herself to encounter you during the storm. That her assistance was calculated to attract your attention and improve her family's circumstances through improper means. That your subsequent interest in their cottage repairs represents not estate responsibility, but rather personal entanglement that she has manipulated." Hartford met his eyes directly. He has been careful to phrase these suggestions as concerns for propriety rather than direct accusations. But the effect has been to spread gossip that damages Miss Croft's reputation while positioning himself as the defender of appropriate social boundaries. Philip felt something snap inside him, not into rage, but into absolute clarity. Finch had not simply been stealing from the estate. He had been neglecting tenants, falsifying records, and now, when confronted with the possibility of exposure, he was attempting to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to protect himself. "Show me the falsified arrears," Philip said quietly. Hartford produced another ledger, this one clearly recently created, with entries in Finch's distinctive handwriting. "This is the version Finch maintains for his own records. Note the discrepancies." Philip compared it against the official estate ledger Hartford had compiled. The difference was staggering. In Finch's personal accounting, the Croft family showed 3 months of overdue rent, arrears that simply did not exist in reality. Similar false debts appeared next to several other tenant names, all families who had submitted maintenance requests that Finch had denied. "He is building a case for evictions," Philip said, the realization settling like ice in his stomach. "He knows the audit is coming. He knows I am paying attention now. So he is creating documentation to justify removing the tenants most likely to expose his fraud. And positioning Miss Croft as a woman of questionable character whose testimony cannot be trusted," Hartford agreed. "If he can damage her reputation sufficiently before any formal inquiry, her account of the estate's neglect becomes merely the complaint of a disgraced woman with a personal grudge." Philip set down the ledgers with careful precision, his hands steady despite the fury coursing through him. How long would it take to prepare a formal case for Finch's dismissal? With criminal charges? 2 weeks, perhaps 3. We need to ensure the documentation is unassailable. You have 1 week. Philip met his solicitor's eyes. And Hartford? I want absolute discretion. Finch must not know what is coming until the moment we move against him. If he suspects, he will destroy evidence and accelerate whatever plans he has for the Croft family. Understood, Your Grace. Though I should warn you, if Finch feels cornered, he may act precipitously. Men in his position often lash out when they sense their power slipping. Then we must ensure he has no opportunity to do so. Philip moved to his desk and pulled out a sheet of writing paper. In the meantime, I want the boundary wall near the Croft cottage completely rebuilt. Not repaired, rebuilt. Proper stonework, professional masons, engineered to last a century. And I want it done immediately. Hartford's eyebrows rose slightly. Your Grace, that will cost considerably more than a simple repair. It will also draw significant attention. Good. Let it draw attention. Let everyone on this estate see that I take maintenance responsibilities seriously, and that tenants who have been failed by my negligence will receive redress. Philip began writing the work order with swift, decisive strokes. The Crofts have been requesting this repair for 18 months. They will have it within 1. Finch will interpret this as confirmation of his implications about Miss Croft. Finch's interpretations will be irrelevant shortly. Philip signed the work order and sealed it. He has stolen from this estate, neglected its people, and attempted to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to cover his crimes. I will not allow him another week of power to do further damage. Hartford accepted the sealed order. And Miss Croft herself? She may not welcome such overt attention, given the current gossip. Philip had thought about this extensively over the past 3 weeks. Every instinct told him to go to her directly, to explain what he had discovered, to apologize for the years of neglect and assure her that justice would be done. But such a meeting would only fuel exactly the kind of speculation Finch was cultivating. It would put her in an impossible position: either accept his explanations and appear to be encouraging improper attention, or reject them and risk appearing ungrateful or hostile to the very landlord her family depended upon. Miss Croft will receive the repairs her family is owed, and her reputation will be restored when Finch is exposed and dismissed, Philip said. Beyond that, I will respect the boundaries appropriate to our respective positions. But I will not allow my failure to maintain this estate to continue destroying lives simply because correction might cause temporary discomfort. He moved back to the window, looking out toward the eastern moors where Beatrice Croft lived in a cottage he should have repaired years ago, where she had stood in a storm and saved his wall with competence and dignity, while he had fumbled uselessly with decorative rope, where she now faced gossip and malice because he had been too blind to see what his own steward had become. She saved more than a wall that night, Philip said quietly, more to himself than to Hartford. She showed me what this estate had become through my neglect, what I had allowed to happen through inattention and misplaced trust. He turned back to his solicitor. I cannot undo the past, but I can ensure that Finch answers for his crimes, that the tenants receive the maintenance they are owed, and that Miss Croft's name is cleared of every vile implication he has spread. And after that, Your Grace? Hartford asked carefully. Once Finch is gone and the repairs are made? Philip thought of gray eyes steady in the rain, of capable hands refusing his money, of a voice saying, "Keep the land safe, sir," as if nothing else mattered. After that, he said, we shall see. The Masons arrived on a cold morning in late October, and with them came the Duke himself. Beatrice was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of multiple carts on the path. Not the single tradesman's wagon that had brought the carpenter, but a proper work convoy with equipment, materials, and half a dozen men who moved with the organized efficiency of a professional crew. She lowered the sheet she had been pinning and watched with sinking dread as they began unloading dressed limestone blocks, timber supports, and surveying equipment near the boundary wall she had temporarily repaired during the storm. And there, dismounting from a horse rather than a carriage, dressed in riding clothes that were fine but practical, was the Duke of Winthrop. He saw her immediately and approached with a directness that gave her no time to retreat into the cottage. "Miss Croft, good morning. I apologize for the disruption, but I wanted to personally oversee the commencement of the boundary wall reconstruction." Beatrice forced herself to curtsy, her hands still damp from the washing. "Your Grace, there was no need for you to, that is, I'm sure your foreman is perfectly capable of—" "I am certain he is," the Duke interrupted gently. "But given that this particular section of wall has been neglected for far too long due to failures in estate management, I felt it appropriate to ensure the work begins properly." His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You identified the problem and provided a temporary solution during the storm. The permanent repair is merely completing what you began." It was a pretty speech, and it might even have been sincere. But Beatrice heard only the underlying message, that she had drawn his attention, that he now felt personally responsible for their cottage, that he was involving himself in their lives with a persistence that terrified her. "The temporary repair was adequate, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "A simple professional crew could have managed the permanent work without requiring your personal supervision." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement? Frustration? Before he gestured toward the wall. "Perhaps you would walk with me. I would value your perspective on the erosion patterns. You know this land better than any surveyor I could hire." It was not quite a command, but it was not quite a request either. Beatrice glanced back at the cottage where her father was resting, and Thomas was presumably avoiding this entire situation by remaining strategically absent. She could refuse. She should refuse. Every instinct screamed that spending time alone with the Duke, even in full view of his work crew, would only fuel the gossip that had already made her last 2 weeks miserable. But he was the Duke, and he was standing in her yard, and refusing him directly would be its own kind of dangerous. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, and walked with him toward the wall. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day where every sound carried and the moors stretched endlessly under a pale sky. The work crew was already setting up, measuring and marking the wall's foundation, and they maintained a respectful distance as the Duke and Beatrice approached the section she had repaired. "Your temporary solution held remarkably well," the Duke observed, examining the stones and timber bracing she had installed during the storm. "My head mason said it showed an instinctive understanding of water flow and soil stability that most trained engineers would struggle to match." "I have lived on this land my entire life, Your Grace. One learns by necessity. Or one learns by paying attention, which is a rarer skill than you might think." He turned to face her directly, and she was struck again by how much younger he seemed up close. Not the distant, powerful figure from church, but a man perhaps a decade older than herself with tired eyes and a sincerity in his expression that felt almost dangerous. "Miss Croft, I owe you an apology." Beatrice felt her defenses rise like walls. "For what, Your Grace?" "For the years of neglect this estate has suffered under my inadequate supervision. For the maintenance requests your family submitted that were ignored. For the systematic failures that put your home at risk while I was too blind or too trusting to see what my steward had become. He paused, and his voice lowered. And for the gossip my attention has caused. That was not my intention, but I am aware of the consequences nonetheless. The apology was so unexpected, so apparently genuine, that Beatrice felt something crack in the careful composure she had been maintaining. Then perhaps, Your Grace, the kindest thing you could do would be to complete this repair and leave us in peace. Your attention, however well-intentioned, has made my life considerably more difficult. I know. The admission was quiet, almost painful. But leaving the repair incomplete, retreating now, would only confirm exactly what people like Finch are suggesting. That my interest in your family's welfare was improper, and that I am now embarrassed by exposure. It would destroy your reputation more thoroughly than my continued presence ever could. He was right, and Beatrice hated that he was right. Finch had constructed a trap with exquisite precision. Any interaction between them would be interpreted as evidence of impropriety. But any sudden distance would be seen as confirmation that there had been something to hide. So we are both trapped by propriety, she said bitterly. How convenient for those who wish us ill. Not trapped, navigating. The Duke's expression hardened slightly. And those who wish you ill will shortly discover that there are consequences for spreading malicious gossip about innocent people. Consequences from you, Your Grace? Beatrice could not keep the edge from her voice. More attention, more interventions, more reasons for people to speculate about your intentions? Forgive me, but your protection feels remarkably like a different kind of threat. The Duke was silent for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its careful formality. What would you have me do, Miss Croft? Ignore the fraud and neglect I discovered? Pretend I don't know that my steward has been systematically failing the people who depend on this estate? Allow him to continue damaging reputations and falsifying records because addressing it might cause you temporary discomfort? I would have you understand that your temporary discomfort and mine are not equivalent. Beatrice shot back, her careful control finally breaking. You risk gossip and awkwardness. I risk eviction, destitution, my father's health, my family's entire future. Every time you appear at our cottage, every time you single us out, you make us more vulnerable to the very man you claim to be investigating. Finch will be dealt with. When? Next week? Next month? After he has found some excuse to declare our rent in arrears and demand our eviction? She gestured toward the cottage. We live at the pleasure of men like you and men like Finch, Your Grace. You may be more benevolent, but you are no less powerful. And power, in my experience, is always dangerous to those who have none. The Duke looked as though she had struck him. You think I would allow Finch to harm your family? I think you are one man, however highly placed, and Finch is clever and malicious and has spent years building his little kingdom of corruption. I think that your intentions, however good, may not be sufficient protection against his malice. And I think... She stopped, catching herself before she said too much. You think what? His voice had gentled, and he took a step closer. Please. I would know your honest concern. Beatrice met his eyes, and for a moment she let him see past her defenses to the fear and confusion beneath. I think you are a good man, trying to do the right thing. And I think that makes you more dangerous to me than Finch's calculated cruelty. Because I am beginning to trust you, despite every instinct telling me that trust between our stations is impossible. Words hung in the cold air between them, more honest than she had intended, more revealing than was safe. The Duke's expression shifted through surprise to something that looked almost like pain. Trust is not impossible, he said quietly. But it must be earned, and I understand that I have not yet earned yours. So I will make you a promise, Miss Croft. I will complete this wall repair because it is my responsibility as the landowner. I will address Finch's corruption because it is my duty to the estate. But I will not force my presence on you beyond what is necessary for those purposes. And when this is resolved, when the repairs are done and Finch is dealt with, I will give you the peace you have requested. It should have been exactly what she wanted. It was reasonable, respectful, appropriate. So why did it feel like loss? Thank you, Your Grace, Beatrice said, her voice carefully controlled again. That is very considerate. He inclined his head formally. The warmth that had been in his expression now shuddered behind ducal propriety. I should return to supervising the work crew. Good day, Miss Croft. He walked away, and Beatrice stood alone by the wall she had repaired during the storm, watching him discuss foundation depths and load-bearing calculations with his head mason, every inch the competent landowner attending to his property. And she hated the small, traitorous part of her heart that wished he had argued, had insisted, had refused to give her the distance she had demanded. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered not by common post, but by a liveried footman from the manor who waited in the yard while Beatrice opened the cream-colored envelope with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure. The Duke of Winthrop requests the honor of your presence at the annual harvest ball, to be held at Winthrop Manor on the evening of November 15th. Carriages at 8 o'clock. It was signed with the Duke's own hand, not the impersonal print of mass invitations, and tucked inside was a second, smaller note in different handwriting, feminine, elegant, unfamiliar. Miss Croft, I am Lady Catherine Pembroke, His Grace's sister. I understand you may have concerns about appropriate attire for the ball. Please allow me to offer the loan of a gown that I believe will suit you admirably. My maid will call tomorrow at 2 o'clock, if that is convenient. C.P. Beatrice stared at the notes for a long moment, while the footman waited with professional patience, and Thomas peered over her shoulder with barely concealed alarm. You cannot possibly attend, Thomas said the moment the footman had departed with her stammered acceptance of the dress offer. Beatrice, this is a trap. Either Finch's or the Duke's, or both, but it is absolutely a trap. I know. She set the invitation on the table with careful precision. Which is why I must go. That makes no sense whatsoever. It makes perfect sense. Beatrice moved to the window, looking out toward the boundary wall where the masons had been working for the past 2 weeks. The repair was nearly complete now, a solid, beautiful piece of stonework that would last generations. The Duke had kept his word about maintaining his distance. She had not seen him since their conversation by the wall, though she had felt his absence like a physical thing. If I refuse, it confirms everything Finch has been suggesting, that I pursued the Duke's attention inappropriately and am now ashamed to face society. If I attend, I control the narrative. I show that I have nothing to hide, that I can stand in that ballroom with my head high despite the gossip. You will be walking into a room full of people who believe you are either a scheming opportunist or the Duke's. Thomas stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Mistress, Beatrice supplied flatly. Yes, I am aware of what they believe. All the more reason to show them a woman who has done nothing wrong and will not be cowed by malicious speculation. Her father, who had been listening from his chair by the fire, spoke for the first time. Your mother would be proud of your courage, Bee, but she would also want you safe. These people, the gentry, the titled families, they are not kind to those they perceive as overreaching. Then they will have to reconcile their unkindness with the fact that I was personally invited by the Duke himself. Beatrice turned from the window, her decision made. I will not hide. I will not give Finch the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. And I will not allow gossip to dictate how I live my life. Lady Catherine's maid arrived the next afternoon with a dress that took Beatrice's breath away, despite her determination to remain unimpressed by aristocratic generosity. It was a gown of deep forest green silk, simple in design but exquisite in execution, with delicate embroidery at the neckline and sleeves that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. It fit her as though it had been made for her figure, which perhaps it had been. She and Lady Catherine were of a similar height and build. The maid, an older woman named Mrs. Perry, with kind eyes and capable hands, stayed to help with the fitting and offered to return on the evening of the ball to assist with hair and final preparations. Her manner was respectful without being servile, treating Beatrice as a lady deserving of professional attention rather than a charity case accepting cast-offs. Her ladyship wanted you to know, Mrs. Perry said as she adjusted the gown's hem, that she has heard the gossip and finds it contemptible. She said to tell you that any woman with the courage to repair a wall in a storm has the courage to face a ballroom, and she looks forward to making your acquaintance. It was such an unexpected kindness that Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back ruthlessly. Please convey my gratitude to Lady Catherine and my appreciation for her understanding. The days until the ball passed with agonizing slowness. Beatrice worked in the garden, helped care for her father, tried to maintain the routines that had structured her life before the Duke's attention had complicated everything. But she was aware, always, of the watching eyes whenever she went to the village, of the whispers that stopped when she approached and resumed the moment she passed, of Mr. Finch's calculating stare from the window of the estate office, patient and malevolent as a spider waiting for prey to stumble into its web. On the evening of the ball, Mrs. Perry returned as promised and transformed Beatrice's practical simplicity into something that approached elegance. Her dark hair was arranged in a style that was fashionable without being pretentious. The green gown made her skin seem luminous in the lamplight. When she looked at herself in the small mirror, she saw not a tenant farmer's daughter, but a woman who might, almost, belong in a ballroom. You look beautiful, Bee, Thomas said quietly when she descended the cottage stairs. There was worry in his eyes, but also pride. Mother would have loved to see you like this. The Duke's carriage arrived precisely at 8, and Beatrice was surprised to find Lady Catherine herself inside, rather than an empty seat. Miss Croft, the lady said warmly, patting the seat beside her. I hope you don't mind the company. I thought you might prefer a friendly face for the journey. Lady Catherine was perhaps 30, with her brother's dark hair and gray eyes, but a warmer, more open expression. She wore a gown of deep burgundy that complemented her coloring, and she radiated the kind of unself-conscious confidence that came from a lifetime of social certainty. You are very kind, my lady, Beatrice said as the carriage began moving. Though I confess I don't understand why you would involve yourself in my brother's romantic entanglements? Catherine's eyes sparkled with amusement. My dear Miss Croft, Philip has been buried in estate management and duty for years. To see him actually interested in someone, genuinely interested, not just politely courteous, is rather delightful. And from what I understand, you are exactly the sort of woman who would refuse to be impressed by a title or intimidated by a duke, which makes you possibly the perfect person for him. Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. I assure you, my lady, there is no romantic. That is, His Grace has been entirely proper. Oh, I know. Philip is always proper. It's rather exhausting, actually. Catherine leaned closer, conspiratorial. But I've seen how he looks when your name is mentioned. And I heard about the wall repair and the cottage roof and his sudden passionate interest in estate maintenance records. My brother is many things, Miss Croft, but he has never been passionate about ledgers before. The carriage was approaching the manor now, and Beatrice could see lights blazing from every window, could hear the distant sound of music. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. I am afraid, she admitted quietly. Everyone there will be watching me, judging me, believing the worst. Then we shall give them nothing to judge except your dignity and grace, Catherine said firmly. You will enter on my arm, which will make it clear that you have the family's approval. You will dance with whomever requests it politely, including my brother if he asks, which he absolutely will. And you will show every venomous gossip in that ballroom that you are a woman of substance who will not be diminished by their smallness. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Music and light spilled out from the manor's entrance. Beatrice took a deep breath, accepted Lady Catherine's offered hand, and stepped down into a gauntlet of staring eyes and whispered speculation. The ballroom was magnificent. All crystal chandeliers and polished floors and masses of autumn flowers in gold and crimson. It was also full of people who turned to watch as Lady Catherine swept in with an unknown woman on her arm. Beatrice could feel their gazes like physical touches, assessing her dress, her deportment, her right to be there. And there, near the refreshment table with a glass of wine and an expression of barely concealed malice, stood Mr. Finch. He raised his glass slightly when their eyes met. A small gesture that might have been a toast, but felt like a threat. Lady Catherine's hand tightened on Beatrice's arm. Steady, she murmured. You belong here as much as any of them. More, perhaps. Now smile, and let us show them what true dignity looks like. Beatrice lifted her chin, fixed a polite expression on her face, and walked into the heart of the ballroom with the Duke's sister at her side and the certain knowledge that tonight would determine everything. Beatrice had survived the first hour through sheer force of will and Lady Catherine's unwavering support. They had made a circuit of the ballroom, Catherine introducing her to various members of the local gentry with such casual confidence that it became almost impossible for anyone to be overtly rude. The conversations had been stilted, full of carefully neutral pleasantries and assessing stares. But Beatrice had maintained her composure, answering questions about her family with quiet dignity and refusing to show any awareness of the speculations swirling around her. The Duke had not yet appeared, though his absence felt deliberate rather than accidental. Beatrice suspected he was allowing her time to establish herself in the ballroom without the complication of his immediate presence. Another kindness that made her chest ache with confused gratitude. She was accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing servant when she saw Finch moving through the crowd with purpose. His expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man about to spring a carefully laid trap. He was carrying a leather portfolio, and he was heading directly toward the small cluster of local magistrates and prominent landowners gathered near the musicians. Beatrice's stomach dropped. She set down her glass and took a step forward, though what she intended to do, she had no idea. Lady Catherine caught her arm. What is it? Finch. I don't know, but something is wrong. They watched as Finch approached Sir Edmund Hart, the senior magistrate, and spoke quietly while opening his portfolio to display what appeared to be official documents. Sir Edmund's expression shifted from polite attention to surprise to something that looked like concern. Other men in the cluster leaned in, examining the papers, and gradually the conversation around them began to fade as more people noticed the commotion. Then Sir Edmund raised his voice, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption, but a matter of some urgency has been brought to my attention. His voice carried the weight of official authority, and the musicians trailed off into silence. Mr. Finch, the estate steward, has presented documentation indicating that one Thomas Croft, tenant of the eastern boundary cottage, has fallen significantly behind in his rent obligations, 3 months in arrears, totaling nearly £15. Beatrice felt the room's attention swing toward her like a physical blow. Lady Catherine's hand tightened on her arm in silent support. Finch stepped forward, his voice pitched to carry sympathy and regret. "I deeply regret bringing this matter to public attention, Sir Edmund. But Mr. Croft's daughter is in attendance this evening, and I felt it my duty to address the situation before it becomes even more serious. The estate has been patient, but we cannot continue to overlook such significant debt." "You're lying." Beatrice's voice cut through the shocked murmurs, clear and steady despite the terror coursing through her. She stepped forward, pulling free of Catherine's restraining hand. "My family has never missed a rent payment. We are paid in full through the end of December." Finch turned to her with an expression of pained concern that made her want to strike him. "Miss Croft, I understand this is embarrassing, but denial will not resolve the situation. I have the ledgers here, official estate records showing 3 months of unpaid rent. Perhaps your father, in his illness, has been unable to manage the family's finances properly. It is not uncommon for... Those records are falsified." The Duke's voice rang out from the ballroom entrance, cold and absolute as winter itself. Every head turned. Phillip Ellington stood in the doorway with his solicitor Hartfelt beside him, and most significantly, the county constable and 2 uniformed officers behind them. He was dressed in formal evening wear, but there was nothing soft or social about his expression. He looked like a man prepared for battle. "Your Grace," Finch began, but the Duke cut him off with a gesture. "Mr. Finch, you are dismissed from your position as estate steward, effective immediately. You are also under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of official documents." Philip moved into the ballroom with the constable following, and the crowd parted before them like water. "The ledgers you are presenting to Sir Edmund are forgeries you created to justify evicting tenants whose maintenance requests you had been systematically ignoring while you stole estate funds for your personal enrichment." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers, but the Duke's voice rose above them. "Over the past month, my solicitor has conducted a comprehensive audit of estate finances. We have documented systematic fraud totaling over £800. We have copies of genuine tenant records showing that the Croft family, along with 47 other tenant households, have been paying their rent in full while being denied essential maintenance. And we have evidence that you, Mr. Finch, have been pocketing the allocated repair funds while allowing tenant properties to deteriorate." Finch's face had gone white, then red, then a mottled combination of both. "This is absurd. Your Grace, I have served this estate faithfully for 10 years. "You have stolen from this estate for 10 years, Philip corrected, his voice cutting. "You have neglected your duties, falsified records, and when faced with exposure, you attempted to destroy the reputation of an innocent woman whose only crime was being competent enough to reveal your inadequacy." He turned to Sir Edmund. "The documents Mr. Finch showed you are forgeries. My solicitor has the genuine records, along with a complete accounting of Mr. Finch's fraudulent activities. Constable Meadows has a warrant for his arrest." The constable stepped forward, and Finch stumbled backward, his careful composure finally cracking. "You cannot do this. I have friends, influence. I know things about the estate, about your family." "Then you can share them with the magistrate at your trial," Philip said flatly. Constable, if you please." The officers moved forward and took Finch by the arms. He struggled, his voice rising to a shout. "This is because of her. Because that scheming little tenant caught your attention, and you've lost all sense of propriety. Everyone knows what she is, what she was trying to." "Mr. Finch." The Duke's voice dropped to something quiet and absolutely lethal. "You will not speak of Miss Croft. You will not think of Miss Croft. And if I hear that you have made any further attempt to damage her reputation or harm her family, I will ensure that your prosecution includes every possible charge and that your sentence is as severe as the law allows. Am I perfectly clear?" Finch said nothing, but the hatred in his eyes was answer enough. The constable hauled him toward the door, and the crowd parted again, everyone staring as the disgraced steward was led away in disgrace. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Philip stood in the center of the ballroom, every eye upon him. And for a moment Beatrice saw the weight of what he had just done settle over his shoulders. He had publicly humiliated and arrested his own steward at a social event. He had exposed fraud and mismanagement that reflected poorly on his own oversight. He had tied himself irrevocably to a tenant farmer's daughter in front of everyone who mattered in county society. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers across the crowded room. He walked toward her with deliberate steps, ignoring the gasps and whispers, ignoring Lady Catherine's delighted smile, ignoring everything except Beatrice herself. When he reached her, he bowed with perfect formality. "Miss Croft, would you do me the honor of the first dance?" Beatrice stared at him, her mind reeling. He had just destroyed Finch, had exposed corruption, had vindicated her family's honor, and now he was asking her to dance, in front of everyone, making his choice unmistakably clear. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to. The gossip will be." "The gossip," Philip said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers, "will be that I danced with the woman who saved my estate's boundary wall during a storm, who showed more competence in 10 minutes than my steward had in 10 years, and whose family has been model tenants subjected to systematic abuse by a man I failed to supervise properly." He extended his hand. "The gossip will be that I chose to honor integrity over convenience, character over class, and truth over comfortable lies. If that damages my reputation, so be it." Lady Catherine was beaming. The ballroom was utterly silent, every person straining to hear their exchange. Beatrice looked at his outstretched hand, steady, certain, offered without reservation or shame, and felt something shift inside her chest. All her careful walls, all her protective pride, all her fear of his power and position, crumbled before the simple fact of his choice. He was choosing her, publicly, irrevocably, with full knowledge of the cost. She placed her hand in his. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was stronger now. "I would be honored." The musicians, sensing their cue, began to play. Philip led her onto the floor as the crowd watched in stunned silence. His hand settled at her waist, and hers rested on his shoulder, and for a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other while the opening bars of the waltz built around them. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered. "For Finch, for the truth, for all of it." "Thank you," Philip replied, just as quietly, "for showing me what this estate had become, for being brave enough to correct a duke in a rainstorm, for being exactly who you are, without apology or pretense." Then they began to dance, and the ballroom watched. And Beatrice Croft, tenant farmer's daughter, wall repairer, defender of her family's honor, waltzed with the Duke of Winthrop as equals, and let the gossips make of it what they would. Winter came to the Winthrop Estate with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself had decided to offer respite after the turbulence of autumn. Finch was tried in December and sentenced to 7 years' transportation for fraud and embezzlement. The trial had been thorough and damning, with Hartford's meticulous documentation leaving no room for doubt or sympathy. Beatrice had not attended. The Duke had quietly suggested that her presence was unnecessary and might subject her to unwanted attention. But Thomas had gone and reported that Finch had shown no remorse, only bitter resentment to the very end. With Finch gone, the estate began a slow process of transformation. Hartford took over temporary stewardship while the Duke searched for a permanent replacement, and his first actions were a systematic review of every tenant property and the authorization of long-delayed repairs. Cottages received new roofs, boundary walls were reinforced, drainage issues were addressed. The cost was substantial, but the Duke paid it without complaint, calling it overdue investment rather than expenditure. Beatrice watched these changes from a careful distance, grateful but wary. The night of the ball had changed things irrevocably. The gossip had shifted from malicious speculation about her character to avid curiosity about the Duke's intentions. But she did not know what those intentions actually were. He had danced with her once, had seen her safely into Lady Catherine's carriage afterward, and had bowed over her hand with perfect propriety and no promises. Then he had given her space, and the space had felt like both gift and loss. He came to the cottage in late December, arriving on horseback rather than by carriage, dressed for riding rather than formal calling. Beatrice was in the garden harvesting the last winter vegetables when she heard the hoofbeats on the path. "Miss Croft," he said, dismounting with easy grace. "I apologize for the unannounced visit. I was hoping you might walk with me. There's something I'd like to show you." Her father was inside by the fire. His health improved now that the cottage was properly maintained and warm. Thomas was in the village. There was no impropriety in a walk, not anymore. Not after the ball. Not after the Duke had made his position so publicly clear. "Of course, Your Grace," Beatrice said, brushing dirt from her hands. They walked in silence at first, following the path toward the eastern boundary. The day was cold and clear, the moors covered in frost that crunched beneath their boots. The Duke's horse followed at a respectful distance, well-trained and patient. "How is your father?" Philip asked finally. "Improved. The warmth and dryness have helped his breathing considerably. He's even talking about working the garden again come spring, though I suspect that's optimism rather than realistic assessment." She glanced at him sideways. The cottage repairs were comprehensive. More than necessary, really. They were exactly as necessary as they should have been years ago. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been reviewing estate records going back a decade. The neglect was systematic and deliberate, but it was also enabled by my own inattention. I inherited this estate at 25 and immediately buried myself in parliamentary duties and London society, trusting Finch to manage things I should have been managing myself. The damage he did is my responsibility as much as his." "You dismissed him and had him prosecuted," Beatrice pointed out. "You've spent a fortune correcting the neglect. At some point, Your Grace, you have to stop punishing yourself for trusting the wrong person." Perhaps. They had reached the boundary wall now, the section Beatrice had repaired during the storm. Except it was no longer a rough temporary fix, but a masterpiece of stonework, solid and beautiful and built to last centuries. Or perhaps I simply want to be worthy of the trust I'm hoping to earn. Beatrice ran her hand along the wall's smooth surface, feeling the expert craftsmanship in every precisely fitted stone. "It's beautiful work. Your masons are truly skilled." They followed the principles you demonstrated during the storm, working with the land's natural drainage patterns rather than against them. The headmason said it was the most intelligent repair design he'd encountered. Philip moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in the cold air. "Beatrice, Miss Croft, may I speak plainly?" Her heart was beating too fast. "I wish you would, Your Grace." "I have spent the past 3 months trying to determine the appropriate way to approach this. The proper interval to wait, the correct degree of formality to maintain, the socially acceptable method of expressing interest across our difference in station." He turned to face her fully. "And I have concluded that there is no appropriate way, no proper method, no socially acceptable approach. There is only the truth, which is that I have not stopped thinking about you since the moment you corrected me in the rain." Beatrice's breath caught. "Your Grace, Philip, please, when we're alone at least, let me be simply Philip." "Philip," she said carefully, testing the intimacy of his given name. "You cannot possibly be suggesting what I think you're suggesting. The difference in our positions is substantial, I know. I have a title, wealth, position in society. You have deep knowledge of this land, genuine connection to its people, and the kind of moral integrity I have spent my entire life trying to cultivate and mostly failing to achieve." He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her work-roughened knuckles. "I need you, Beatrice. Not as a tenant, not as a passing fascination, but as a partner. Someone who will tell me when I'm managing things poorly. Someone who understands what this estate requires because you've lived it rather than inherited it. Someone who sees the land not as property to exploit, but as a trust to maintain. You need a land steward, not a wife," Beatrice said, but her voice shook. "I need both, and I want them to be the same person." He drew her closer, his gray eyes intense and absolutely certain. "I am asking you to marry me, Beatrice Croft, not despite our difference in station, but because of what that difference can create together. Your knowledge joined with my resources, your integrity guiding my power, your connection to this land preventing me from ever becoming so blind and negligent again. People will say I trapped you, that I manipulated. People already said that, and I didn't care." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "I am a duke. I have wealth and position enough that I can marry whomever I choose, and society will eventually accommodate itself to the reality. And I choose you. I choose your competence, your pride, your refusal to be impressed by titles or intimidated by power. I choose the woman who saved my wall in a storm and refused my money, because the work itself mattered more than payment." Beatrice felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm afraid. Of your world, of failing you, of course you are. I'm terrified too." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face into something warm and almost boyish. "But we'll be terrified together, which makes it considerably less daunting." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the Duke of Winthrop with all his power and privilege, but simply a man who had spent 3 months quietly proving his sincerity through actions rather than words, who had exposed corruption at personal cost, who had given her space when she needed it and was now offering partnership rather than protection. "Yes," she said, and the word came out somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Yes, Philip, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, with the winter sun cold on their faces and the sound of the moors stretching endlessly around them. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he murmured, "that Lady Catherine has already begun planning the wedding. She's very enthusiastic about finally having a sister who won't be intimidated by her managing tendencies." Beatrice laughed, the sound bright and free. "Then we're both in trouble. I'm not particularly good at being managed." "I know. It's one of your many excellent qualities." They stood together by the wall she had repaired and he had rebuilt, and Beatrice felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not the resignation of someone accepting their fate, but the certainty of someone choosing their future. Their wedding took place in early spring in the village church, where the Duke had first publicly acknowledged the Croft family. Beatrice wore the green silk gown Lady Catherine had lent her for the ball, and Philip stood at the altar with his heart in his eyes. And Thomas gave his sister away with pride, and only minimal threats about what would happen if the Duke ever made her unhappy. They honeymooned at Winthrop Manor, spending the days riding the estate boundaries and meeting with tenants, making plans for improved drainage and better crop rotation and all the practical matters that made Beatrice's heart sing with purpose. Within a year, the estate was transformed. Tenant satisfaction increased, productivity improved, and word spread through the county about the Duke who had married his estate's most competent tenant, and together they had created something remarkable. A model of responsible land management that balanced profit with genuine care for the people who worked the soil. Within 3 years, Philip had been asked to speak before Parliament about estate reform. He had declined, sending Beatrice instead. Her testimony about the realities of tenant life and the economics of sustainable agriculture had caused a minor scandal and prompted 2 significant pieces of reform legislation. Within 5 years, they had 2 children and a marriage that had become the subject of romantic speculation across England. The Duke who had chosen integrity over station, and the woman who had saved his wall and his soul in a single storm. And on winter evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, they would sometimes walk together to the eastern boundary wall and stand where they had first met, where she had corrected him and he had learned to listen, where the foundation of everything they had built together had been laid in mud and rain and the simple act of doing what needed to be done. "Do you ever regret it?" Philip asked one such evening. "The gossip, the scrutiny, the constant navigation of society's expectations?" Beatrice leaned into his warmth and looked out over the moonlit moors she had always loved. "Never. Do you?" "Not for a single moment." He kissed the top of her head. "You are the true keeper of this land, Beatrice. You always were. I just had the good sense to recognize it." She smiled and took his hand, and together they walked home across the estate they had saved. Not through power or wealth alone, but through partnership, trust, and the simple revolutionary act of seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway. The land remembered, and the wall stood strong. And that's how a woman who repaired a wall in a rainstorm became a duchess who reformed estate law before Parliament. But here's what breaks my heart. If you loved this story, if Beatrice's refusal to be diminished meant something to you and you still haven't subscribed, you're making sure fewer people ever find stories like this. YouTube doesn't promote content to non-subscribers, which means every person who watched Beatrice stand in that ballroom, who cheered when Philip arrested Finch, who cried when he proposed by the wall she saved, everyone who felt something but didn't subscribe, just made it harder for the next person to find a story about a woman whose competence was her power. So here's my ask. Subscribe. Not for me. For the next viewer who needs to see a woman correct a duke and marry him anyway. Share this with someone who's tired of women being rescued and wants to see women doing the rescuing. And comment below. Would you have gone to that ball? because I want to know if you've got Beatrice's courage or if you'd have hidden in the cottage. Now go subscribe. The algorithm is watching, and unlike Finch, we actually want it to see us. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories Team.